Hello and welcome to this really short tutorial on the A-level speaking exam for languages, focusing on the stimulus cards. The examples I'll be using today will be in Spanish, however, the different strategies that I take you through will be applicable to the other languages studied at A-level, as long as the specifications AQA. So, before we get going, it's probably important to have a quick look at the breakdown of the speaking exam at A-level and what it's composed of. It lasts 21 to 23 minutes in total, and in that 21 to 23 minutes, you'll get 5 minutes set aside where you can prepare your answers to the stimulus card. So you've got two different parts. Your first part is a stimulus card. You're presented with two cards. You pick one, and it's a discussion of the sub-theme that appears in one of the two cards. You get to pick, and that forms the basis of discussion. The second element, that's slightly longer, that is 12 minutes, is the presentation and discussion of your IRP. That is a 2-minute presentation which you can memorize that outlines your findings, and then you've got a 9 or 10 minute discussion of your findings that'll ask you to elaborate on points that you've made, give opinions, bring about some more justifications, or clarify some of the points that you've made in your presentation. For the purpose of today, we're just going to focus on the first part, the discussion of your sub-theme studied and the stimulus card. That's the first 5 or 6 minutes of your exam. So, the stimulus card. You'll get given two cards that cover two sub-themes that are not related to your IRP. I'm sure your teachers will check very, very carefully to make sure there's no overlap, but it must not relate to your IRP. You get presented with two cards, you pick the card that you prefer, and you get 5 minutes of preparation time to prepare answers to 3 questions that you're presented with, and also to write down some other ideas of things that you might want to cover, any case studies that you might want to bring in as well on that sub-theme. And that card forms the basis of a discussion. Note that's a discussion, so it's not a case of just give 3 answers and give 3 really developed answers. Your teacher will be interjecting with other questions, random questions that are related to that sub-theme that you must be prepared for as well. What's really important is during the stimulus card, you must ask 2 questions that are related to the card. So the questions have got to be related to the sub-theme. They must contain a verb, so unlike GCSE where you can get away with just asking "itu," you can't do that. You've got to seek information or an opinion. So something along the lines of, for instance, if you're talking about dictatorships and revolutions, you might ask "¿Qué opinas de las dictaduras en Latinoamérica?" Something along those lines. So you're actively seeking an opinion rather than giving an answer and then simply stating "¿Y tú?" Doesn't work. You've got to ask 2 questions that relate to that card during the 5 or 6 minutes. Now, don't worry, because I know in the heat of an exam, you're probably thinking about all the points you want to give out, what you want to do, but your teachers can prompt you if you forget to ask the questions, so don't worry about that. So, if we're aiming for the top marks, what's probably really important is that we look at the mark scheme. Now, the mark scheme is made up of 4 different parts, and it's out of 25 marks. You've got 4 assessment objectives that are assessed. You've got AO1, which is all about delivery, your giving of opinions, your justification and development of opinions, given reasons why, and your ability to respond to the unpredictable questions that your teacher will ask. So those additional questions that supplement the 3 that you're given, can you respond to those? Can you give a convincing answer to those and give your reasons why and your justifications? AO2 is all about the understanding of the information on the card. As you'll see when we move on, when we look at preparing the card, you're given some stats, you might be given some opinions, what people have said, some quotes, and AO2 is all about, have you understood that information on the card? Can you analyse it? And can you get that information across to the examiner? AO3, however, is looking at the vocabulary, the complexity of the language that you're given, your accuracy in terms of your grammar, and also your pronunciation. And finally, AO4 is all about your knowledge and understanding of the sub-theme aspects. So AO4 is all about taking what's on the card and taking it further. So if you're talking about dictatorships in Spain, it might be, can you identify any dictatorships in Latin America and what the consequences and what the effects were of those dictatorships? For instance, it might be about Pinochet in Chile, for instance. Those kind of things. So taking that sub-theme further, and do you really know that sub-theme inside out? Which can throw a spanner in the works, because if you are presented with a card and you might look at it and you might think, oh, it's a nice easy card, it's quite straightforward, but if you don't know any additional facts about that sub-theme, then actually that card might be not the one for you to use. So do bear that in mind when you're picking the card. So these are the top bands for each assessment objective. So if we have a look at assessment objective 1, for 5 marks, your delivery's got to be fluent throughout. Now, what's really important when it says delivery is fluent, they don't expect you to have the level of fluency that a native speaker would have. Okay, so it's not native speaker standards by any means. You've got to give ideas and opinions, and you've got to develop them, and you've got to develop them independently of your problems. So your teacher shouldn't be asking you really, ¿Por qué? What it should be doing is you should be giving an opinion, you should be giving facts, you should be giving evidence that back up your opinion. So you really need to know case studies, essentially, for each sub-theme. And then students give an appropriate response to nearly all unpredictable elements. So can you answer the unpredictable questions that your teacher puts at you as well? In terms of assessment objective 2, where it's looking at the information that you're given on the card, the response that you give shows that you have a good understanding of the material on the card. So that's looking primarily at the first question, that AO2 mark. And we'll see what that looks like in a second. AO3 is all about the vocabulary and the language that you use. So do you use a wide range of vocabulary? Is it complex, the language that you're using? And can you use good knowledge and appropriate idiom as well? Now, idioms, as well as we'll see in a minute, it doesn't mean using things such as cuesta un ojo de la cara, for instance. So it's about using structures that pertain to the language. So I'll give you an example. Things such as me fascina, it fascinates me. That me fascina, using the indirect object pronoun, that is something that structure pertains to Spanish. That counts as idiom. Even using something such as tengo 20 años, I'm 20 years old. In English we say I am, in Spanish they say I have 20 years. So knowing that is how that expression works in Spanish, and using it correctly, that actually counts as idiom. Okay, so it's not as hard as you think it is. Okay, so don't fall in that sense of panic over that. Highly accurate application of grammar with occasional minor errors. So you are allowed minor slips. We'll look at what major and minor errors look like, and your pronunciation and your intonation are very good. And the last assessment objective, so the AO4, which is all about the sub-theme and your understanding of that sub-theme. Good knowledge, very good knowledge and understanding of those aspects in the sub-theme covered in the discussion. Students consistently select relevant information to support their arguments. What that is implying is that you have case studies up your sleeve, you've got examples up your sleeve that you may have covered, and you can thrash those out during the exam and talk about them and explain the importance of them. They consistently use appropriate evidence to justify their conclusions, demonstrating a very good evaluation of the sub-theme. So this is about giving an opinion, giving a justification, and then rounding it off. You must round off your opinions, linking it back to the question in hand. Really, really important. So that's the mark scheme. Having looked at AO3, which is all about the language and the accuracy, these are a couple of really quite important points that come out from the mark scheme. So AQA defines serious errors as those that adversely affect the communication. So it might be something like, me gusta Madrid porque es aburrida, right? I like Madrid because it's boring, okay? That adversely affects the communication because we don't know if you actually like it or not. Therefore, that would be a serious error. In terms of idiom, when we're looking at that specific clause of AO3, an idiom is a form of expression that is particular to the target language. So the easiest example, like I said before, that expression of giving an age using tener rather than ser to be. So in terms of minor errors, AQA define minor errors as confusion of the noun and adjective. So for instance, if you get peligro, danger, and peligroso, and dangerous confused, they will count that as a minor error. And occasional slips in gender and adjectival agreements. So note that it says occasional. You're allowed one or two, but if you're consistently getting them wrong, then that will turn from a minor error into a major error. So do be aware of that. If we're looking at serious errors, we're looking at incorrect forms of the verb. So for instance, if you are incorrectly using the preterite tense, an example that I see a lot is people using tuvo instead of tuve for I had. That's a major error. The incorrect use of pronouns as well, that's going to cause you to lose marks. Errors in basic idiomatic expressions. So es muy calor instead of hace mucho calor. Soy 17 instead of tengo 17 años. So beware of those. So those are your errors. However, things that you do actually gain credit for, the complex on the flip side, you're looking at things such as subordinate clauses. So looking at relative clauses, such as, you might be looking at things such as, hay un hombre que vende palomitas de maíz en la plaza mayor. There is a man who, or there's a man that. So using your que, using your donde, using your cuando without your accents. Remember, if it's got an accent on, then it turns into a question word and interrogative. Using those que, your donde, your cuando to link two separate phrases together, that's complex. Your conditional expressions, so looking at your second conditional, si fuera rico me gustaría comprar, or si fuera alcalde me gustaría cambiar, using that second conditional, taking it even further in the past, si hubiera ido al mercado, habría comprado un pastel. Okay, so using that third conditional, if I had gone to the market, I would have bought a cake. So those if clauses count as complex as well. Using the subjunctive as well, the appropriate use of subjunctive. So what you don't want to be doing is you don't want to be going too far with the subjunctive. Sometimes you get what our class is subjunctivitis, which is where people just shoehorn the subjunctive in left, right, centre. You don't need to go mad with it. have a few kind of stock phrases up your sleeve that you can roll out nice and freely and nice and easily in the exam, such as es importante que consideremos. It's important that we consider. A really easy one is if you're starting out with a point, you might use the subjunctive in the we form to use the term let's. So, for instance, consideremos el hecho de que. Let's consider the fact that. That's a really, really easy sentence opener. All you need to remember is that you use the we form in the subjunctive for let's. Let's consider. Really, really easy. You can shoehorn that in nice and straightforward. If you start mixing up, for instance, es importante consideremos without the que, that's when you start getting errors. Okay, so it's appropriate. It's the correct use of the subjunctive. Variety of tenses and reflexive verbs. Nice and straightforward. So can you use the imperfect tense along with the preterite tense, for instance, to create a sense of kind of narrative? Use of impersonal expressions, so things such as se puede, se debe, one can, one must. Using reflexive verbs or verbs with indirect object pronouns, such as gustar, so using me gusta, a mi padre no le gusta, me interesa, le interesa, for instance. Using value judgments. And the easiest one for complexity more than anything else is any verb followed by an infinitive, and you might need a preposition after that. So, for instance, me gusta pensar, I like to think. Me gustaría añadir, I would like to add. Things like that. So a verb plus an infinitive construction also counts as complex. Now, that's not an exhaustive list. These are just things that I've taken from the mark scheme. So now it's important that we look at actually preparing the card itself. Now, before we look at actually preparing a card itself, I mentioned before that for your assessment objective 4, it's about looking at the sub-theme and taking it that step further. What I would suggest you do before the exam, and this is just something that I've put together for my students in the past, is that you have some case studies, some facts, some figures up your sleeves that you can just get out in the exam, write them down in your preparation time and explain the importance of them. So having something for each sub-theme written down. What I've done is I've aligned it with, as you can probably see, the A-level textbook, the AQA level textbook, so that students can go through, write down some key figures, write down some key quotes from the textbook or from their wider reading as well. You need to read around and explain the importance. And also have some space as well to use Cornell notes, just to write down some general ideas, some general information about that module, and as well space to prepare questions that are related to that theme as well. So I would really, really encourage you before your speaking exam to go through, make some lists of case studies, make a list of key words, some questions that you can prepare so that when you get into that exam for that AO4, you're going to pick up the marks there quite easily and quite readily. So this is what your stimulus card will look like in the exam. You'll be given a choice of 2, you pick one. What's really important is you do not write on the card itself, you must write on AQA paper. And this is because your teachers need to keep hold of your notes until the exam season is finished with and the AQA say we can dispose of them. So don't write on the card, they have to be reused, write on the AQA notes paper. In this instance, I'm going to write on the card just so you can see my notes alongside the card at the same time. You'll be given the general theme, so artistic culture in the Hispanic world. You'll be given the sub-theme as well, la identidad regional, so I can see the parameters in which I'm working with. The questions at the bottom, the first one is all about what's on the card. So that's what the first one is. So essentially this one's the one that's test number A02. Then we've got en tu opinión, ¿por qué dan los españoles tanta importancia a sus especialidades regionales? So why do they give so much importance to their regional specialities? So I listen to my opinion, I need to give some evidence, I need to give some explanation why. And the last one, ¿qué sabes de las diversas influencias culturales que ha habido en la cultura española? This one is where we launch a little bit more into our AO4. It's asking me about diverse cultural influences on the Spanish culture, so I have to bring in my wider knowledge at this point. Now you've only got 5 minutes to prepare this card, so the first thing I would do is I would read it and look for the key facts. What is this card all about? So we've got Galicia y su gastronomía del mar y de la tierra, so it's talking about gastronomy, it's food, and we know that it's from seafood and it's also from the land. So I need to mention that. Land produce, sea produce. We've got some typical dishes here. We've got la empanada gallega, it tells me what it's made of, la tarta de Santiago, so the little Santiago tart, and what it's made of, and the same, we've got el pulpo a la gallega, so squid. Got a little bit more text underneath. It's important to read this, and what we need to do is we need to boil this down into essential parts for this first question. So hay más de 300 fiestas gastronómicas a lo largo del año. So there's more than 300 food festivals throughout the year. So really important that we mention that. That's important. En esta comunidad autónoma, en las que se come y bebe lo típico de la región. So it's all about little things like mentioning about drink as well, really, really important. Because it's not just about the food, it's also about the drink, as we can see, whereas we're just giving pictures of food. So do that in mind. The next one, los productos que promocionan se cultivan allí. So this is talking about, it's not just about local dishes, but also about local produce. So I've done that now. I've broken down that card. That's my first step. And broken down the key points that I want to get out of that card. So we've got our questions. These are the 3 questions that we get below, where it says preguntas. And just note that you're given 3, but obviously your teacher will be asking you follow-up questions based on this sub-theme, so do bear that in mind. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to start writing down some notes. You're not going to be able to script out everything you're going to write. I would write something for each point and then come back. So the first one, ¿qué nos dice esta información sobre la gastronomía de Galicia? So we can say, I would probably put kind of like a little introduction that summarizes what this card is about. After this, I would then say, por ejemplo, hay la empanada gallega, la tarta de Santiago, and give a few examples after that and mention what they are. And I would link it back and also say, I would probably want to talk about the economy as well. If there's so many food festivals, it's also going to bring in lots of money for the economy, so therefore the food is obviously important to its cultural identity. It's important to there's a lot of variety, it comes from the sea. If there's lots of food festivals, it's going to benefit the economy. And I would also mention probably as well that it's also part of the patrimonio as well. So the second point, en tu opinión, ¿por qué dan los españoles tanta importancia a las especialidades regionales? I would come back to that and maybe add some more points if I have time. I'm going to move on to this third one. ¿Qué sabes de las diversas influencias culturales que ha habido en la cultura española? So for this last question, I probably want to talk about an example of a diverse cultural influence on the Spanish culture. I probably want to mention Al-Andalus. So as you can see, in those minutes, and by the time you've actually read the information, you've gotten some of your points down, you're not going to have much time to actually plan it. Once you've got this down, it's about taking your points and it's about synthesizing them and putting them together. It's pretty much like in writing an essay. You want to give your point, give your evidence, explain its importance, and then really importantly, give it the so what. Link it back to the question. Really important that when you're talking, you follow that through. You could even write that down. Point, evidence, explain, so what, and link it back. The last thing that I would be doing before we finish and before you go into the exam is take your time just to write down your 2 questions as well. Regional identity, first thing I might do, remember I've got to solicit an opinion or information. So I'm going to start with, okay. What do you think about regional festivals in Spain? That ticks the box. I'm talking about cultural identity. The second thing, do you think there are negative aspects to regional festivals? And again, that refers back to la identidad. And there we have it. So the first thing you want to do when you're preparing your card, highlight the information, put it in your own words. You want to write something for each point, for number 1, number 2, number 3. Write your 2 questions down as well, so you've got them to hand. Make sure they relate back to the sub-theme. And then if you get any extra time, then you can go back and add to your points. I would also write on your card really clearly, point, evidence, explain, and so what, so that you're constantly evaluating as you go. I hope that tutorial has been useful, and good luck in your exams.